So I've been putting off making this video for a while, and I think it's because attempting to analyze Over the Garden Wall is a bit overwhelming. Not because I think it's too complex or too mysterious, but the story is just too good that it's hard to do it justice. Sometimes breaking down a story takes away some of the wonder and amazement of it. However, today I'm going to attempt to psychoanalyze this masterpiece, and hopefully it'll still retain all the magic that makes the show so fantastic to watch. I think that there are a lot of great interpretations out there for what's going on in Over the Garden Wall. One fairly common depiction of the show is a modern tale of Dante's Inferno. Parallels are drawn between Wirt and Dante, the name Beatrice, and their journey into a mysterious and eerie unknown place. While the comparison isn't perfect, I think there's a reason that these two stories have been equated. They both are very obvious depictions of the hero's journey. If you aren't familiar with the hero's journey, I've covered it before in my Spirited Away analysis, so be sure to check that out. Now, I don't want to go through all the steps of the hero's journey and how Over the Garden Wall follows this narrative. Rather, I like to look specifically at Wirt and his development throughout his time in the unknown. I think that one interpretation that has really resonated with me is that Wirt is going through a process that psychoanalyst Carl Jung called individuation. There's a lot to unpack whenever Jung is brought up, so I'll do my best to demystify some of the jargon. Before we get into Wirt specifically though, we have to talk about what the unknown actually is. If we're approaching this from a Jungian perspective, the unknown is the collective unconscious. In Jungian psychology, there are two realms of the unconscious: the personal unconscious, which would include underlying attributes, memories, and structures that are attributable to a single person, and the collective unconscious. This is a realm that is transpersonal and includes the different symbols and archetypes or fundamental personality themes that are common to all humanity. The collective unconscious is a place of concepts and ideas. These archetypes include concepts such as the anima/animus, the shadow, and the self. I'll elaborate on these later, but first let's look at some evidence of this collective unconscious. When Wirt and Greg are in the graveyard before they begin on their adventure, we see a familiar name on a tombstone. If you didn't catch it, that's Quincy Endicott, the same Uncle Indy that we've seen earlier in the series. Next, when we're at the end of the series and we get a glimpse of how some of these character stories wrap up, we see this figurine. Obviously, this is the highwayman from the tavern. Lastly, we see that Beatrice is back with her family and they're no longer Blue Jays. Now, take a look at how they're dressed. This is a stark contrast from how people are dressed in Greg and Wirt's world outside of the unknown. So what do all of these examples have in common, and how does this prove a collective unconscious? While the characters in the unknown aren't physical manifestations, rather they're reduced down to ideas, concepts, and these archetypal themes. Quincy Endicott was alive at one point, however, when we meet him in the unknown, we're meeting a representation of Quincy Endicott that is based on the psyche of the actual person who lived. The idea of the highwayman is who sings about his profession in the tavern, not an actual person. This is expressed further by the inability for any one person in the tavern to have an identity beyond their one-dimensional attribution. Whether it be the highwayman, the tavern keeper, or their apprentice, these are all one-dimensional identities that are mental representations. Now, Beatrice is a bit different. We do see that she is a real person and she did have real experiences in the unknown. However, Beatrice in the unknown becomes an archetypal representation to Wirt, and she plays a key role in his development. If you needed any more evidence, the show alludes to this concept in the very first episode. As the narrator states, a mysterious place called the unknown, where long-forgotten stories are revealed to those who travel through the wood. Wirt, in his time in the unknown, is going through the process of individuation. In the book Jung's Map of the Soul by Murray Stein expresses that individuation is the term Jung used to talk about psychological development, which he defines as becoming a unified but also unique personality, an individual, an undivided and integrated person. Through Wirt's time in the unknown, he is challenged to assimilate and integrate all parts of his personality in order to become a unique individual. We see this development in two separate phases for Wirt. This same psychological development occurs in Jung's writings as the first half of life and the second half of life. When Wirt and Greg find themselves in the unknown or collective unconscious, they are completely lost. Hope seems to be lost as they are wandering about aimlessly in this foreign landscape. Beatrice plays a role as their guide, and she represents what Jung would call the anima. This archetype is important to the self-realization that is integral to the process of individuation. The anima is the archetypal image that represents the feminine aspect of man, as opposed to the animus, which represents the masculine aspect of woman. The anima in Jung's conception acts as a guide or a mediator between consciousness and the collective unconscious. According to Stein, the anima potentially opens a way to the self. This is exactly what we see from Beatrice. She becomes the guide for Greg and Wirt as they travel through the unknown. Beatrice aids in the realization of two important psychological developments for Wirt: his ego consciousness and his persona. When we discuss the development of ego consciousness, we can use an analogy regarding how children relate to their parents. Specifically, when a child is in infancy, they are controlled by their parents and have little to no say in what happens to them. All responsibility is alleviated and they lack any autonomy. They can whine and fuss and express simple desires such as wanting to eat. However, they are fed when the parents want to feed them, they are changed when the parents want to change them, and they are held when the parents want to hold them. Thus, they are connected to the parents in a very personal way. They lack any personhood and are essentially an extension of the parents. This changes when the infant is able to speak and can express autonomy in the form of the word no. At this point, children can express whether they would like something or whether they wouldn't like something. This is the development of autonomy, the separation from the parents, and the manifestation of ego consciousness. Wirt goes through a similar phase in Miss Langtry's classroom. Throughout this episode, Beatrice expresses to Wirt that she knows he's a pushover and can't say no. He's an extension of everyone else's will and lacks autonomy and the ability to make his own choice. Beatrice pushes Wirt until he decides he's had enough, and like the infant who first says no, Wirt breaks off from the will of others and develops into the first stage of psychological development, his ego consciousness. Now that Wirt has distinguished his psyche from that of another's, he can move on into the next stage of development, which is the development of a persona. The persona is the identity we use as social creatures. This is a psychological construct that acts as a social mask that allows us to relate to others. As we've discussed earlier, there's a whole tavern filled with these personas. When Greg and Wirt stop into the tavern to ask for directions, Wirt gets asked who he is. When he responds with his and Greg's names, the tavern keeper doesn't accept that as an answer. She responds with, "That's great, but who are you?" Wirt doesn't have a persona that he can use to relate to anyone in the tavern, and they quickly let him know that he's out of place here. The patrons of the tavern explain who they are in terms of their personas. These are one-dimensional descriptions of themselves that lack any real depth. All of the patrons are only their social masks. Not that this is a negative thing, however, their persona encompasses the totality of their personality, and thus they are lacking in complexity. Wirt quickly dons the persona that is given to him, which is that of the pilgrim. Wirt now has developed himself as an autonomous person and has developed some sort of identity, regardless of how superficial and simple this identity is. We can now move on to the second half of Wirt's development. The second half of psychological development is one where Wirt's ego integrates and recognizes his unconscious. We can think about his psychological development as follows. The first half is an attempt to differentiate from others and sets the foundation for what we can call Wirt's personality. Wirt's ego development that we discussed earlier differentiates himself from others, as he asserts his autonomy and makes decisions regarding himself. He is no longer an extension of others, he has become his own vessel. The development of the persona is the first realization of a unique personality. Wirt becomes the pilgrim. Wirt has created an identity for himself, and although there are other pilgrims out there, within the tavern he was the only pilgrim, and thus he has his first taste of a unique self. The second half of his psychological development pushes him even further in an attempt to individuate, or create a unique and whole, one-of-a-kind individual. This is undergone through the integration of the conscious with the unconscious. Stein states the second half of life involves a different kind of movement from what transpires in the first, however. In this second phase of individuation, the pattern's accent is not the separation of the ego from its background and from its identifications with the milieu, but rather the unification of the whole personality. This unification occurs through the interactions of Wirt with three different archetypes: the anima, the shadow, and the self. We have already discussed the anima as Beatrice and know her role is to guide Wirt along his journey. In terms of the shadow, the beast is a very clear-cut example of this archetype. The shadow is the repressed and unaccepted aspects of the personality. These are the things we would rather not look at within ourselves, whether it be rage, lust, or hatred. They are the things we can't stand to consider as part of us. Examples of the shadow archetype are ubiquitous. More often than not, the villain in stories represent the shadow. For example, the Lich from Adventure Time or Scar from The Lion King are both representations of this archetype. The next integral archetype is that of the self. That's a self with a big S, not to be confused with lowercase self. The archetype of the self is typically represented as a wise old man, a king, and the embodiment of the potential of a person. They are seen as complete and as an individual who has gone through the process of individuation. Over the Garden Wall does something very interesting with this archetype. Instead of representing the self as something that Wirt can look forward to if he succeeds in his attempt at individuation, the self becomes a cautionary tale. I think that the woodsman is the archetype of the self. However, this self has been perverted, and instead of a whole, unified, wise old man, we see a fractured and unfulfilled woodsman. These three archetypal images and his ability to integrate these aspects of himself are what allows him to journey down the path of individuation and become a whole and unique person. Beatrice has led Greg and Wirt further and further into the unknown, and eventually they become separated. Greg and Wirt are alone and freezing and seem to be lost forever in this unfamiliar place. Luckily for Wirt, he has Greg. I'm going to take a shot in the dark, but I think that Greg also reveals an important psychological development for Wirt. Often in the show, we see that the hero of the day is typically Greg. However, it is not through any rational or intellectual means, nor is it through any superior strength that Greg may have. Greg represents potential and creativity for Wirt. Greg is young and is amazed at the world around him. He's enthralled with everything and uses his imagination and creativity whenever he can. Wirt, on the other hand, is rigid and rational. Though he is a poet and a musician, he doesn't have the same wonder and whimsy as Greg. Nearing the end of the series, Greg has a dream, and this dream is incredibly relevant psychologically speaking. A common practice amongst psychoanalysts, and Jung was no exception, was dream interpretation. Jung departed from his former role model, Freud, in that he didn't believe that dreams were simply repressed desires and secret wish fulfillment. For Jung, dreams spoke in symbols, which is also the language of the unconscious. It is not through Wirt's own conscious deliberation that he confronts his shadow and the archetype of the self. He goes to find Greg, who has volunteered himself to go to the beast. Greg makes this decision after having his adventure in his dreams. When Wirt does eventually find Greg, the beast, or Wirt's shadow, tells Wirt that he can save Greg by putting him in the lantern and taking over for the woodsman as the lantern keeper. Psychologically, Wirt confronts his shadow and is told that he could save his potential, i.e. Greg, and become a distorted and corrupted version of the self, i.e. the woodsman, which would hinder him from becoming a unique and whole person. Rather than becoming a unique and whole person, or the wise old man, Wirt would forever be fractured and incomplete in his personality, similar to the woodsman. However, this is just a ruse from the beast. Wirt is able to see past this facade from the beast and realizes something incredibly profound. If he were to accept the beast's proposition, Greg wouldn't actually be in the lantern. The lantern houses the beast himself. This means that rather than integrating and accepting his shadow as a part of Wirt, the shadow would be rejected. However, the shadow doesn't disappear. It just becomes unacknowledged. Becoming the lantern keeper is essentially denying your shadow exists, yet you keep him with you wherever you go. This allows the shadow to become unintegrated, and this leads to pathology, forever fragmenting the personality. This is what we see has happened to the woodsman. The woodsman is a cautionary figure, as a potential self that Wirt could become should he fail to properly recognize and integrate his shadow. Wirt has successfully been led through the unconscious by Beatrice and confronted both his shadow and self. He has been able to integrate these archetypal figures, and once he realizes this, he is free to go back home. Wirt and Greg leave the unknown and return home, and we're left to question what really happened during their adventure. If we listen to Jung, we can see that Wirt was on an arduous journey to discover himself, and he has become a complete and unique individual. Hopefully we can take some cues from Wirt, and we can start our own path towards individuation.